morning of November 9th, 2005, in Robinson, Texas, a peaceful, close-knit town just south of Waco. But on this particular day, tranquility shattered with a single phone call. A woman, her voice panicked and urgent, dialed 911 to report that something horrific had taken place inside her home. The details were unclear, but the tone said everything. Something was very wrong. That single call would open the door to a tragic tale that left a tight community reeling, a family devastated, and the public stunned by what was soon to emerge. This is the story of Darlene and Keith Gentry, a marriage filled with love, promise, heartbreak, and, ultimately, profound tragedy. If you're a fan of true crime and criminal investigations, you won't want to miss our new book, The Ultimate Book of Serial Killers, 180 Files of the World's Most Notorious Murderers, now available on Amazon. You can also purchase the PDF version directly from our website for instant download. You'll find the link in the video description and in a pinned comment. Now, let's dive into today's case. Darlene Castillo was born on November 2, 1974, the middle child of 3 daughters in a devoted family. From the beginning, those around her saw a spark. Relatives and friends remembered her as radiant, disciplined, and full of life. A girl who was not only beautiful on the outside, but warm-hearted and deeply ambitious. Growing up in Central Texas, Darlene quickly became a local favorite, known for her dazzling smile, her blonde hair, and her natural ability to connect with others. Though she never officially held a beauty queen title, Darlene earned the nickname Texas Beauty Queen from classmates and teachers alike. She was voted prom queen, joined the flag corps, and always seemed to be at the center of every school event. Her charm wasn't forced, it was effortless. She stood out not just because of her looks, but because of her genuine nature. She made people feel seen. Admired by peers and deeply loved by her family, she was a young woman with a clear path ahead of her. In 1993, she graduated from Yo High School in Cameron and enrolled at Texas State Technical College in Waco. Initially drawn to the dental field, she pursued training as a dental assistant, but her long-term goal was to become a nurse. It was during her college years that she met someone who would completely change the trajectory of her life, Keith Gentry. Keith, born on September 2, 1974, in Waco, was the son of Wayman and Glenda Gentry. He spent his childhood in Robinson, a town where community and family still held strong meaning. Keith had 2 sisters and a wide circle of extended family who cherished him. At Robinson High School, he was known for his easygoing personality and his quiet strength. He wasn't flashy or outspoken, but those who knew him appreciated his reliability and kind-hearted nature. Keith didn't crave attention. He simply did what needed to be done, without complaint. Like Darlene, he also enrolled at Texas State Technical College, where he pursued studies in drafting and welding. He later secured a stable job as an engineering assistant at a utility company, setting himself up for a solid and responsible future. Keith had the soul of a provider, focused, hardworking, and already thinking about the kind of life he wanted to build. Friends and family often said he was a family man, even before settling down. When Keith and Darlene met, the connection was immediate. Their chemistry was undeniable, and it didn't take long for them to fall deeply in love. Darlene's family quickly embraced Keith, and Keith's family welcomed Darlene with open arms. Everyone around them assumed a wedding was only a matter of time. But like many young couples, their timelines didn't always align. By 1997, both had graduated and were preparing to take the next steps in life. Darlene, by then, quietly longed for a proposal. Keith, on the other hand, wasn't quite ready to commit to marriage or even living together. After several honest conversations, they made the painful decision to part ways. Their families were blindsided, and neither Darlene nor Keith handled the separation easily. Both were deeply hurt, unsure of what the future held without each other. Seeking a fresh start, Darlene moved to Dallas. There, she returned to dental work and tried to adjust to life in the city. But the fast-paced lifestyle didn't suit her. A stolen car incident and the disconnection of urban living eventually took their toll. After about a year, Darlene returned home, and fate seemed to be waiting for her. She and Keith soon crossed paths again. This time there was no hesitation. Their reunion was swift and decisive. In 1999, Keith proposed, and not long after, they were married. It felt like everything had finally fallen into place. The young couple purchased their first home and began building the life they had once only dreamed about. For Darlene, however, something still didn't feel complete. Though she had returned to her dental career, she realized her true calling lay elsewhere. Motivated and determined, she went back to school, this time to pursue her nursing degree. Keith supported her ambitions completely, proud to see his wife working hard toward her goals. They were, by all accounts, a happy couple. They laughed often, shared responsibilities, and embraced their roles as partners in life. By the early 2000s, Keith and Darlene Gentry had settled into what seemed to be an ideal life in the quiet community of Robinson, Texas. Just a short drive from Waco, their home stood in a peaceful suburban neighborhood, coincidentally, right next door to Keith's parents. That closeness would prove both comforting and eventually deeply complex. Keith held a steady job as an engineering assistant at the local electric utility company, while Darlene worked as a registered nurse. With two stable incomes, they enjoyed a comfortable lifestyle, not extravagant, but sufficient to raise a family and enjoy occasional luxuries. Family was at the heart of their dreams. In 2001, their first son, Chase, was born. Cody followed in 2004, and by 2005, they welcomed a third son, Cade. The Gentry seemed to transition into parenthood with ease. Supported by both sets of grandparents, they built a life rooted in love, stability, and family traditions. They were the kind of family others looked up to. Attractive, devoted parents, 3 beautiful boys, and a well-kept home. But beneath the surface, the reality was far more complicated. Keith's job often required travel, leaving Darlene to juggle her responsibilities at work and home on her own. She managed the children, maintained the household, and kept up with her duties as a nurse. However, even when Keith was home, the balance of responsibilities didn't shift much. He was often drained from his travels and sought rest rather than jumping into the chaos of parenting. Recognizing the strain it was placing on his marriage and home life, Keith eventually made the decision to leave his better-paying, travel-heavy job for a lower-paid desk position that would keep him closer to home. It was a move made out of love and practicality, but it came at a cost. The reduction in income strained their finances, and Keith began to feel trapped in a job he found dull and unfulfilling. He missed the challenge and momentum of his previous role. Frustration took hold. Meanwhile, Darlene's spending habits reportedly didn't change. She maintained a pristine home, hosted gatherings, and continued buying things they could no longer reasonably afford. Their arguments often centered around money. Keith believed she was careless with their finances. He grew resentful as more and more childcare responsibilities fell on him and his parents. Friends and relatives began noticing a change. The once happy couple now seemed tense. There were quiet complaints, subtle emotional distance, and mounting pressure. Still, there was no indication that either Keith or Darlene wanted a divorce. Keith, in particular, seemed determined to hold things together. But everything changed on the morning of November 9, 2005. At exactly 6:11 a.m., a distressed Darlene called emergency services. Her voice trembled as she described a chilling scene. The back door of their home was wide open, and her husband, Keith, was lying in bed, covered in blood, barely breathing. She told the dispatcher that some of Keith's guns were missing and described how he was gurgling, with pink foam bubbling from his mouth. Darlene claimed she hadn't slept beside Keith that night. Their youngest son, just 18 months old at the time, had been restless. According to her, she had taken the toddler into a separate bedroom where their other two sons were sleeping and stayed there. To help them fall asleep, she said she played a movie and remained in the room until 6 a.m. when she awoke, discovered the back door open, and found her husband gravely wounded. Paramedics arrived at the Gentry residence shortly thereafter. Keith was still alive, but barely. He had been shot in the head and was completely unresponsive. The pink foam at his mouth, a sign of severe trauma, suggested that he was unlikely to recover. Emergency crews rushed him to Hillcrest Baptist Medical Center in Waco, where he was placed on life support. Despite the efforts of medical personnel, Keith Gentry never regained consciousness. 2 days later, on November 11, 2005, he was pronounced dead. A homicide investigation was now underway. Detectives quickly turned their attention to the only other adult present in the home that night, Darlene. Her version of events became central to the case, and she was brought in for questioning almost immediately. Darlene told police that the evening of November 8th had begun uneventfully. She had gone out for dinner and drinks with friends, returning home around 8:30 p.m. But what she walked into, she said, was not a warm welcome. Keith, according to Darlene, was upset. He had discovered a restaurant receipt, evidence of yet another expenditure he viewed as reckless and irresponsible. Given their financial difficulties, it struck a nerve. The two argued, and Darlene said she left the house in frustration, driving around to cool off. When she returned later that night, she claimed she apologized and tried to move past the disagreement. Keith went to bed in the master bedroom, and Darlene stayed with their 3 sons in one of the other rooms. She insisted this was to help settle their youngest child, who had been fussy that night. She recalled waking briefly around 5:15 a.m. after hearing the dog bark, but, thinking little of it, since their dog occasionally barked at nothing, she went back to sleep. Around 6 a.m., she said, she got out of bed, walked through the house, and went to wake Keith for work. When he didn't answer her, she entered the bedroom and found him lying in bed, unresponsive and bleeding. She also claimed to have noticed that the back door was wide open and that their locked gun cabinet had been tampered with, its contents gone. Darlene's version of events painted a chilling scenario. Someone had broken into their home during the night, murdered her husband, and stolen a number of firearms, leaving no trace behind. But as the investigation progressed, detectives began to notice troubling inconsistencies that called her entire narrative into question. To begin with, the timing. Darlene stated she hadn't checked on Keith until 6 a.m., but forensic analysis suggested the shooting likely occurred well before that. The trajectory of the bullet, the pooling of blood, and Keith's medical condition pointed to a significantly earlier attack, one that would have been difficult to sleep through. More red flags appeared at the scene. While Darlene had claimed that multiple guns were missing from the cabinet, investigators discovered several of them stacked neatly just outside the back of the house. This wasn't consistent with the behavior of a typical burglar in a rush. In fact, it looked like someone had carefully placed the weapons there, perhaps to stage a scene. Adding to the suspicion, only two people had access to the gun cabinet: Keith and Darlene. Whoever opened it knew where it was and where the key was hidden. It didn't make sense for a random intruder to have such specific knowledge about the home's layout and security. Then there was Darlene's behavior. As a trained nurse, she had the skills and the presence of mind to administer CPR or at least check for signs of life. But she didn't. When paramedics arrived, she hadn't made any attempts to help Keith, nor had she left the room to guide them. Instead, she stayed locked in with the children, claiming fear for their safety as the reason. Investigators took note of another oddity: the 911 call itself. Rather than the frantic panic one might expect from someone who had just found their spouse shot in bed, Darlene's voice was remarkably composed. She spoke clearly, offering a surprisingly detailed timeline of her actions and sleeping arrangements. Her tone came across more like someone trying to explain away suspicion than someone in the midst of crisis. Later that same morning, Darlene sat down for a formal interview at the police station. But the moment the questions became more direct, she hesitated. Without warning, she invoked her Fifth Amendment right and asked for a lawyer. The interview was immediately stopped. Despite this, Darlene maintained that she had done nothing wrong. In her own words, she claimed she loved her husband and would never do anything to harm him. She spoke about their life, acknowledging the financial strain and the pressure of raising 3 small boys, but insisted that their problems were ordinary, not anything that would lead to violence. Still, investigators couldn't ignore the gaps in her story. The evidence suggested something far more intimate and far more calculated than a home invasion. As detectives dug deeper, questions continued to mount. Who had the motive? Who had the access? And who had the opportunity? Though Darlene's voice cracked with emotion in her statements, at times tearful, at times confused, her words did little to shift suspicion away from her. She spoke of Keith's love for his boys. She insisted that she loved him too. Still, suspicion wasn't enough. Authorities needed hard evidence. With Darlene's consent, they searched the Gentry home again. There were no signs of forced entry, something they had expected, but what they did find would prove far more damning. Buried deep inside the kitchen trash bin, investigators uncovered a pair of latex gloves. Hidden within the gloves was a single .22 caliber shell casing, traces of gunshot residue, and DNA that pointed to just 2 people, Keith and Darlene. It was a major breakthrough. Then came a possible motive. Detectives learned that Keith had a life insurance policy valued between $500,000 and $750,000. For someone in financial distress, it was enough to raise serious questions about intent. 19 days after the shooting, on November 28, 2005, Darlene Gentry was arrested and charged with murder. But the arrest didn't last long. That same day, Keith's parents, who had stood loyally by her side, posted a $50,000 bond to secure her release. The Gentry family, including Keith's own parents, refused to believe Darlene could be capable of such a crime. They stood by her, unwavering in their support. To them, she was not just Keith's wife, but the mother of their grandchildren, someone they trusted and loved. But then, new and startling information emerged. Not long after her release on bail, Darlene contacted a local landowner and acquaintance, Robert Pavelka. She expressed interest in purchasing a rural piece of property near Axtell, Texas. The land featured a serene pond, and Darlene remarked that it reminded her of Keith's dream to take their sons fishing, a touching sentiment if it had ended there. But a few weeks later, Darlene called Pavelka with an unusual request. She asked if he could fill in the pond. The sudden change was jarring. Just weeks earlier, she had been enthusiastic about the water feature, seeing it as a tribute to Keith's memory. Now, she wanted it gone. Pavelka sensed something was wrong. Troubled by the request, he contacted the authorities. Detectives immediately took interest in the pond. If Darlene wanted it filled so badly, they reasoned, perhaps it was because it concealed something she didn't want found. A search was quickly organized, and what they discovered confirmed their instincts. At the bottom of the pond was a .22 caliber revolver, the same caliber as the shell casing found in the gloves. It was the murder weapon. Yet despite the circumstantial weight, investigators still needed a direct link, something undeniable. And so, they turned to Pavelka again, this time asking him to help set a trap. He agreed. Posing as if he were going along with her request, Pavelka called Darlene and said he was preparing to fill the pond, but first, he needed to drain it. Police were banking on the possibility that if Darlene knew the pond might be emptied, she'd act fast to remove any incriminating evidence still inside. She took the bait. Over the phone, Darlene remained calm and agreeable. She didn't object. She didn't panic. But the very next day, under the watchful eyes of hidden surveillance cameras, she arrived at the property. Wearing wading boots and carrying a rod, she stepped into the water and began poking at the pond bed, at the very spot where authorities had already retrieved the gun. The entire event was recorded, and with that, detectives had what they needed. In February 2007, Darlene Gentry, 32, stood trial in McLennan County, Texas. The trial lasted 5 days. She faced a charge of first-degree murder for shooting her husband while he slept in their Robinson home. The prosecution's case centered on the surveillance video. Darlene in the pond, trying to recover the murder weapon days after it had already been seized. It was the moment that shattered her defense. The gloves in the trash, the staged burglary, the conflicting timeline, all of it now pointed to one undeniable conclusion. Her defense team chose not to call any witnesses during the trial's guilt-innocence phase. They relied instead on cross-examinations and procedural arguments, but the evidence was too strong to overcome. On February 8, 2007, the verdict was delivered, guilty of first-degree murder. Darlene Gentry was sentenced to 60 years in prison. The prosecution argued that her motive was both emotional and financial. She wanted out of her marriage. She wanted freedom. And she wanted the financial security that came with Keith's life insurance payout. In their final remarks to the jury, prosecutors warned against being swayed by appearances. Darlene is currently serving her sentence at the Dr. Lane Murray Unit in Gatesville, Texas. In November 2017, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals denied her request for a new trial. Her conviction remains intact. According to official records, she will be eligible for parole in February 2037. If parole is denied, she will serve her full sentence until February 2067. Darlene Gentry has always maintained her innocence, but the consequences of that November morning have reached far beyond her prison cell. In 2010, a judge granted permanent custody of Chase, Cody, and Cade to Keith's parents. A restraining order was issued, prohibiting Darlene from having any contact with her sons. According to court documents, she hasn't spoken to them since. Keith Gentry was a man defined by quiet strength. A devoted father, a loyal husband, and a hard-working provider, he chose family over ambition, stability over status. He left behind 3 young boys, a grieving family, and a legacy built on integrity and love. Though his life was tragically cut short, those who knew Keith remember him not for how he died, but for how he lived. His memory endures in the hearts of his family, his friends, and especially in the lives of the sons he loved more than anything.
Thanks for tuning in to Unreal True Crime. If you're intrigued by mysteries from around the world, check out our new channel, Latin Crimes, where we dive into the gripping true crime stories of Latin America. Don't miss out. Subscribe now for more thrilling investigations.